For the past few decades, the American comic book industry has been dominated by two companies, Marvel and DC. While it's standard fare for media-related markets to be commanded by a few large corporations, the case of the comic book direct market is an especially odd one. Think about it. Marvel and DC combined have controlled around 60% of the industry's market for decades, and they primarily publish one kind of comic: superhero comics. You see how that puts the American comic book industry in a very weird spot, right? Marvel and DC's near absolute power in the direct market means that superhero stories cast a shadow over everything else, making the industry's offerings seem way more homogeneous and samey than they actually are. While television, film, video games, and novels are all known to be mediums where a variety of stories are told, monthly comic books are associated with superheroes and not much else. But how did it come to this point? How did superheroes come to carry the entire comic book market on their mighty shoulders? And what happened to every other genre that once graced the newsstands? To understand the prominence of superheroes in American comic books, we have to go back to the origin of the superhero, the golden age of comics. In 1938, Action Comics issue 1 was published by National Allied Publications, making a killing on the newsstands and selling out its first print run of 200,000 copies. The comic was an anthology consisting of 11 self-contained stories from a wide array of genres, but one of those stories went down in history as arguably the most important comic of all time. You know which one I'm talking about, the story that featured Superman for the very first time. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's initially unsellable creation turned out to be a dazzling sensation, ushering an entirely new genre of storytelling. Superman was a fresh take on the pulp hero. By day, he was the mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent, but when disaster struck, he would don a brightly colored costume and use his powers to save the world from criminals and corrupt leaders. At the time of Action Comics issue 1's publication, comics were a relatively new art form, and Superman's success symbolized the potential the medium had to tell unique and original stories. Today, not only is the book regarded as the catalyst of the superhero craze, but also the cultural phenomenon that brought upon what historians call the golden age of comics, the period that saw the comic book industry fully take form. A year after Action Comics issue 1 was released, the Man of Steel would get his own monthly comic all to himself, and every other publisher worked as fast as a speeding bullet to come up with their own version of the Big Blue Boy Scout. The late 30s and early 40s brought about some iconic characters that have stood the test of time. Heroes like Batman, Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, and Captain America dominated the golden age of comics alongside Superman. During this era, a plethora of other heroes were also created, some that have lingered in the cultural consciousness, and many that have been lost to time. From the history that I've recounted so far, I think it's quite easy to understand why superheroes have a close relationship with American comics. The launch and success of Superman led to the first big comic book boom. But the golden age of comics is very different from the industry today. While superheroes were the top dogs of the comic book world at the time, many other genres were thriving as well. Sci-fi, horror, romance, detective, western, animal, and crime comics all saw success and made the medium an art form that anyone could enjoy. After World War II ended, some of these genres, notably horror and crime, would overtake the superhero genre as the hottest thing on the stands. For a period in the 1950s, William Gaines's EC Comics was the largest comic publisher in America, printing a wide variety of stories by talented creators that pushed the medium to greater heights. You might think that the comics of this era were juvenile and shallow, but some of EC Comics' stories broke narrative conventions and are impressive even by today's standards. Fall Guy for Murder is a detective tale with a tragic ending that features the villain using a story within a story within a story to defeat the main protagonist. Judgment Day is about an astronaut from Earth who visits Cybrinia, a robot planet in outer space, and doesn't allow its residents to join the Great Galactic Republic because of racism and prejudice within their society. By the end of the story, the astronaut takes his helmet off, and we see that he's black. These two stories were created in the early 1950s, but creators were already able to play with narrative structure in interesting ways and boldly discuss social issues with impactful storytelling. When we think of older comics, we think of pulpy trash made to make money, and while a good chunk of comics published during the Golden Age are of questionable quality, amazing, riskier stories were always present during the medium's inception and actually became more prominent as the years went on. But what happened to the other genres that once outclassed the superhero? If they reigned over Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman in the mid-40s and 50s, how were they overthrown and sent to their graves? Well, the death of most other genres of comics came because of a single stamp. This is the Comics Code Authority's seal of approval, and it is probably the most iconic symbol in comics history, even being included in the intro of the beloved Spider-Verse films. It's also the reason why other genres in comics faded into the background. Ever since the comic book emerged as a popular art form in the 1930s, the medium was faced with controversy for being a literary step down from novels that lowered kids' attention spans and occasionally contained graphic content. But a moral panic surrounding comics emerged in the 1950s, particularly due to psychologist Dr. Frederick Werther's book, Seduction of the Innocent, which linked comic book reading with juvenile delinquency. He believed that comic books, especially those that involved crime and horror, were a societal ill that influenced kids to take part in a life of crime, famously saying to the US Senate Subcommittee hearing on juvenile delinquency, "I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry." His campaign to raise awareness on the danger of comics worked. It led to Senate hearings, televised programs, and comic book burning events that put a target on the industry's forehead. While the government didn't take legal action against the comic book industry, sales for comics dropped to such an extent that publishers had to organize a way to win back the public's favor. Thus, the Comics Code was born, a series of rules comic publishers could comply with in order to obtain a seal of approval that ensured parents and distributors that their comics were appropriate for children. Under the Comics Code, good was required to triumph over evil, the government wasn't allowed to be depicted in a negative light, villains could not be sympathetic characters, and the word crime wasn't allowed to appear alone on a comic book cover. Any scene related to zombies, werewolves, ghouls, or vampires was prohibited from being printed, as well as any kind of intense violence or nudity. These restrictions banned genres like horror altogether and prevented comics from telling stories with adult themes and complex narratives. The era of the Comics Code Authority was an extremely dark one for the industry, causing major publishers like Fawcett Comics, Quality Comics, Fox Comics, and EC Comics to eventually financially collapse and cease operations. All hope seemed to be lost, but a speedy superhero rushed to the rescue and restarted the superhero boom. Because of the Comics Code Authority's influence, horror and crime stories were pretty much eradicated from newsstands. The American comic book industry entered a new era, one wherein they had to play it safe to please distributors and parents. Their periodicals had to be sanitized and uncontroversial, devoid of any excessive violence or sexual content. Comics were incentivized to feature morally righteous characters that were paragons of virtue. So guess what fading fad the Comics Code Authority accidentally allowed to flourish once again? That's right. Superheroes were back, baby! In 1956, a rebooted version of The Flash graced the cover of DC's Showcase number 4 and sparked interest in superheroes once again. Before the Scarlet Speedster's first appearance, the only superheroes DC regularly featured were Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Green Arrow. But the new Flash ended up winning over the hearts of readers and ushered in what most comic historians refer to as the Silver Age of Comics, an era when wacky and weird superhero stories populated the newsstands as a result of the Comics Code Authority. It was also during the medium's Silver Age that Marvel Comics became a publishing juggernaut by revolutionizing the idea of a superhero. The heroes of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko weren't masculine do-gooders that served justice without complaints. The Fantastic Four couldn't always get along with each other. Spider-Man was a teenager with financial and girl problems. The X-Men were a stand-in for oppressed minorities. Many of Marvel's heroes were flawed individuals who didn't have perfect lives, and their success changed the notion of what a superhero could be. Someone you could not only look up to, but also someone you could stand alongside and relate to. By the end of the Silver Age of Comics, Marvel and DC were the big two in the industry. Of course, there was Archie, Charlton, Harvey, and Dell Comics, but they were merely sidekicks in the dynamic duo's path of success. Fast forward to today, and both companies are still the top dogs in comics, attracting readers through superhero stories. Today, the comic book landscape has shifted dramatically. Single-issue comics today are sold in specialty shops instead of newsstands, with digital copies being available due to the evolution of technology. Comics, once a cheap and accessible pastime, are now a prestigious product with a high price tag due to numerous factors such as the dwindling monthly reader base, the higher quality material used to produce comics, and the cash cow that was comic book advertising slowly disappearing over the decades. Over the years, there has also been a rise of indie comic book creators telling stories outside the superhero genre that have garnered critical and commercial success. Comics have even gone beyond the monthly periodical, with collected editions and graphic novels being new avenues for creators to reach more readers. But after all the change the medium of comics has undergone over nearly a century of existence, monthly American comics have still been dominated by superheroes. And that's both a blessing and a curse. Superheroes dominating American comic books is a double-edged sword. On one hand, they're the gift that keeps on giving. The success of Marvel's Ultimate Universe and DC's Absolute Universe is what kept comic book stores afloat last year. Superheroes are the comic industry's cash cow, and without them, the business of comics might implode. Also, superheroes being synonymous with the medium of comics is wonderful for fans of the genre. If superhero fans want to throw themselves into worlds populated with crime fighters in colorful costumes, they immediately know which art form to turn to. I think a lot of us can testify that superheroes were our gateway into the medium of comics. If the members of the Avengers, X-Men, and Justice League weren't prominent parts of comics, we might not have fallen in love with the art form. Personally, I owe my love of comics to my childhood love of superheroes, which stemmed from being obsessed over the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy when I was much younger. But superheroes swallowing American comic books whole can also be interpreted as a curse that binds the industry from reaching more people. It can be argued that American comic books being so superhero-centric limits the demographic the market can cater to. Non-superhero comics by indie publishers are some of the best comics out there, and they would probably be more popular if monthly comics didn't have the stigma that they only offered stories for superhero fans. We probably have friends who would love James Tynion IV's work on horror comics like The Deviant, The Department of Truth, and The Nice House on the Lake. There are probably introspective individuals in our lives who would adore Ram V and Andre Felipe's comics, The Many Deaths of Layla Starr and Rare Flavors, which explore the human condition with incredible visual flair in an exciting yet thoughtful way. But it's often us, superhero fans, who also like other genres of comics, who have to share these incredible gems with our friends or siblings because they're so hidden. Of course, original indie comics like Saga and The Walking Dead do strike gold once in a while and become bestsellers, but they're the exception and not the standard. It's extremely difficult for non-superhero comic books to strike out due to the market being populated by a superhero-loving majority. This subject is incredibly complicated for me. Superheroes being the biggest genre in American comics can be taken in both a positive and negative light, and I personally don't know how to feel about it. On one hand, I credit the superhero genre sitting on the industry's throne for the formation of this channel and my love of comics. But on the other hand, I wish other genres were just as prominent as the superhero, not just because I want comics to be in a financially healthier place than it is right now, but because I want monthly comic books to be a space where all kinds of readers and creators can thrive and celebrate art together. Imagine the world we'd have if the comic book industry was known for publishing all kinds of stories from a wide array of genres. Maybe American comics would be as influential and financially successful as Japanese manga. Maybe more experimental genre-bending stories would be able to top the sales charts. We can't really turn back time though. The Comics Code Authority's impact on the industry has led superheroes to reign as king. Or maybe they'd be sitting on the throne anyway, given that cape stories have also been leading the world of film and television. No matter what you think of this subject though, and I know you have mixed feelings on the matter too, superhero comics are not going up and away anytime soon. For better or worse, cape comics will likely continue to hover over other genres in the comic book industry. My name is Joshua C, and I will see you in the next one.